Welcome to the Run Out. I am your host, Neil Barrett. Well, I promised you guys a second episode this week to make up for missing the last couple of weeks, and here I am. I know I am just as shocked as you are, but hey, let's not look a gift horse in the mouth too much. Let's just enjoy the moment while it lasts. Today, I am super stoked because I am joined by my friend, Phil Shore. If you are not familiar with Phil, let me give you a little bit of a rundown. He has been covering lacrosse for over 15 years. He has written for outlets like the Boston Globe, Inside Lacrosse, the New England Lacrosse Journal, and USA Lacrosse Magazine. And most recently, he has been serving as the PLL beat writer for the California Redwoods. On top of that, Phil is also an author. Back in 2020, he wrote a book called Major League Life, which dives into the 2019 MLL season. If you are even remotely interested in lacrosse, but especially if you followed the MLL back in the day, you have to check this book out. Phil was kind enough to send me a copy late last year. It sits right here, and I absolutely tore through it. It is one of those books that just pulls you in, and before you know it, you have finished it in a single setting. It is not that thick, so you can definitely get through it in a good afternoon if you are dedicated. I really cannot recommend Major League Life enough. In today's episode, Phil and I dive into a bunch of different topics. We start by talking about his experiences covering the MLL, what it was like during those years, and writing the book Major League Life. Then we touch on his next book, not too deep. We get into a little bit about what it's about, just a little teaser for now, but I think it is something that you guys are really going to enjoy when he does come out with it. After that, we shift gears into his role with the PLL now, and Phil gives me his thoughts on the Nat St. Laurent situation, as well as what's been going on with the Redwoods as they work towards building that roster for this upcoming season. I had such a great time chatting with Phil. He's got an incredible wealth of knowledge and is super fun to talk to. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this conversation. So without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, we are here with Phil Shore. Phil is I want to say world renowned. That might be a little heavy handed given the nature of lacrosse being cliche, but he is a writer, has covered professional lacrosse for 15 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, close to it. I guess if you count my time covering the NLL as well, the Boston Blazers. Yeah, 2009 was when I started covering them for New England Lacrosse Journal. So, yeah, looking at, just closing in 15, 16 years, I guess, which is crazy.
Yeah, no, time absolutely flies. So we've interacted some on social media for a year or two, maybe even a little bit longer. I think there was some interaction on Instagram, but it's really been since I've got into Twitter in the last year or so. But I am not super familiar with your story, so I figured that was a good place to start. Just kind of where you got into lacrosse and how you kind of ended up where you are today.
Absolutely, and I guess I try to make it not too long and boring, but it definitely goes back a little bit now. So I grew up in Toms River, New Jersey. And if that town rings the bell, there's probably two reasons why. One would be the Jersey Shore TV show on MTV, which was filmed in Seaside, which is just over the bridge, maybe, 5-10 minutes away from my town. So, where they were gym, tanning, and laundry, that was Toms River. The other reason would be in 96, Toms River won the Little League World Series. So it's a big baseball town. That was Todd Frazier, who went on to play in the majors for the Yankees, the Reds, the Mets. So I grew up in Toms River, but I did not play baseball. I played soccer growing up, and my freshman year of high school, in New Jersey, soccer's in the fall. We were looking for something to do in the spring, and we didn't really want to run. Me and my friends didn't really want to run track. Baseball, we've never played baseball, so that was an immediate no because you've got established players there. But that was the first year we had lacrosse in our school district. There was a club had formed, a youth club had formed a couple years earlier, and some of those kids and parents got lacrosse into the school district. So that was the first year, and we were like, well, if it's new, how good can everybody else be too? So we just signed up, didn't know what we were doing. I remember the first day of practice, the coach, I borrowed all the equipment. And the coach was like, all right, what position you play? I looked at him, I was like, I don't know what the positions are. And he was like, we always need more midfielders. So you go run midfield, which was probably the worst position for me because I was a bigger kid that didn't have the best endurance. Later on in college, I wound up playing both attack and defense, both much better suited for me. But so I started playing in high school, and the first season when you're learning the skills, you don't really know what you're doing. Every day I'd be like, I'm just getting out here. We had a bunch of football players that would just want to hit us, and I'm like, I'm getting hit every day. I'm tired. I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing out here? And then as the season progresses and we eventually got like a specific JV coach and everything, and you start learning the skills, you're like, oh, this is pretty addicting. And it got really fun really fast. So I played all 4 years in high school. Then I went to college and played at Emerson College, Division III. At the time, we were in the GNAC. Now they're in the new MAC, so they've definitely bumped up competition since I've left. But played in college, and that's where I went to college for print and multimedia journalism. And people would send out job offers and opportunities through the messaging board. And there was one for New England Lacrosse Journal. And the editor at the time knew my coach. And he's like, hey, I got to display this for the whole school, but you got a lacrosse team. You got to have one guy on the team that's a journalism major. And it was me, and he showed it to me. And, because he was looking for, at the time, there weren't many people knowledgeable about the sport enough to write about it. And got me in touch. I applied for the listing, whatever the application was. I think it was just send an email saying you were interested, and maybe a clip or two. And I started in 2009, like I mentioned, covering the Boston Blazers at the time of the NLL. And that was when they had Dan Dawson and Casey Powell and Josh Sanderson. So every weekend there was a home game. I'd go to the TD Bank Center or TD Bank North Center, cover the game, do the press conference after. And it was really a lot of fun. And from there, I like to say it's been a career of do one little thing and then do that well enough that something else pops up. Hey, you've done a good job with this. Let's try to get you a little bit more. Let's do this. So then I was doing a monthly Q&A for the back page. And then at one point there was an entire issue where I think I did 90% of the articles in the issue. But it just grew from there. I did my own kind of live radio podcast for a little bit. I saw on Twitter, there was Corey McLaughlin sent a post that USA Lacrosse Magazine was looking for someone to do a weekly MLL thing. I was like, well, that sounds perfect. Applied for that. They got me doing that. So since 2012, I had been working with USA Lacrosse Magazine, and it's just kind of been stepping stones to more work in lacrosse. That was kind of where it's all come from.
You said that you have covered the game since 2009 in some form or fashion. You've written for US Lacrosse and New England Lacrosse Journal, and according to your US Lacrosse profile, you wrote for the Boston Globe at one point.
I did, yes. When I was in college, there was a program that it was a paid internship at the Boston Globe, and I covered high school lacrosse for a season, which was really cool.
That's pretty cool. I now live a little over 50 miles outside of Boston, so that is where we go. So that it's become an area that's kind of near and dear to me, even though I never ever thought that would ever be the case, being from the South. But anyway, you covered the sport in some form or fashion since around 2009, and then in 2020 you released your book Major League Life, which I did do some prep for this episode, but that is not why this is sitting right here. It literally sits. I would have had to reach about this far in order to get it. It sits right there on the edge of my desk. It's one of the books that I love having access to, and you were gracious enough to send it over to me and signed it. That was my one requirement, was that if you sent it, you had to sign it. What led into you even wanting to write this book?
Well, since I was a kid, before even lacrosse was in my world, I wanted to write. Enjoyed writing. I would write all these little stories. I feel like my grandpa, who we lived with, was a storyteller, and he would tell all these stories about his childhood and his kids. My mom, my uncle, and everything. And I'd hang on every word. And when I realized that I loved the storytelling, writing became a part of it, and I would write up all these little stories. I would read books and write up summaries. I would make my own little comic books. Writing has always been something I've loved to do. And as I got along with it, especially I think it was around, when I was writing for USA Lacrosse magazine, it got to the point where I was writing, a feature story every week. And it was, you'd work on this piece, it would publish, and you'd have this quick hit of everybody's reading it, everybody's responding to it or reacting to it. And you're like, this is exciting. And then it was like, by the next day, it was like, oh, I got to work on like next week's piece. So it was just such a fast turnover. And I was like, I really want something that can stand the test of time, that you can kind of point to, and it's just always there. That at the time I didn't have kids, now I do, but that I could hand to my kids and say, look what I did, as opposed to a lot of the stuff on the internet. If they redo the website, it's gone. I remember I had that moment when I worked so hard on a feature piece about Chris Hogan, after he was on Hard Knocks, and like a year later they redid the website, and that you can't find that piece on the internet anywhere. I saved a draft of it, and now I have it in my little ebook of essays that I also have, but you can't find that anywhere. So I wanted something in print that I could have and hold to cherish and pass down. And the other part of it just came from, I love going to the bookstore, and my wife and I sometimes just on a date night would be just, let's get some ice cream and go walk through Barnes and Noble. And you get to a point where you can't buy every book, so you're looking for something specific. And there was never a lacrosse book. There's been a few since, but there was never a lacrosse book. So I was like, well, instead of waiting for someone else to write it, why don't I write it? And that's kind of where it came from.
That's awesome. It's such a fun, and it's a relatively quick read. I'd encourage anybody who has any interest in lacrosse, generally speaking, but especially if you were around, if you watched the MLL, I think it has so much like insight into what it was like in the league. I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite story from your time covering the MLL, whether it's in the book or not, or just something that really kind of tells the story of the MLL.
Yeah, there are a lot of great stories in that book. And like you said, it's really cool, now having that book, because even if you were a fan at that time, it's kind of that quick hit of nostalgia too, with some of those names like that you haven't thought of. But my favorite story, and it might be ever, but definitely in the book, is Kai Yamamoto from the Denver Outlaws. He was a goalie from Japan. He traveled to the U.S. Well, he learned about lacrosse when there was some kind of camp or clinic that came to Japan. He was like, that's really cool. I want to do that. So he bought sticks and everything. And then he was going to take over his dad's business or work with his dad, and his dad was like, well, you need to learn English. So he went to college in the United States, found a club team, and he tried out for the Denver Outlaws 3 times before, open tryouts, before finally making it on the team, and he became the first Japanese player to play in the league. And I just think his story was so cool, and it's been a cool connection. I've kind of reached out to him on a few different topics since then, and he's always been so gracious. But I find that story was just so cool that, like, I mean, he was coming over. I think one of the tryouts, he came to the States. He wasn't in college anymore. He came to the States, tried out, went back to Japan, found out that they wanted to bring him back, and then flew back for, I think, either a second round of tryouts or something like that. Like, that's how much it meant to him. And that's what I was trying to really grasp with the book. It was really interesting because when I came up with the idea for the book, it was before the PLL had come to be. So I had this idea of, just all these different guys that were either playing in their hometowns or, just a much bigger pool of players that I was going to be interviewing. And then the PLL came about, and I had already, purchased some flights and hotels and things like that. But I think that split between the PLL and the MLL that year when I wrote it in 2019, I think it actually made it even more interesting because I was able to find, more players that, at that time the PLL was getting all the buzz, rightfully so. They were doing all these things that deserve the buzz, but the people that stayed in MLL were looking for an opportunity. And I think their stories, they were kind of the underdog stories, and they were really cool to tell because for as much as, that Rob Pennell was still in the league at that time, and I wrote about Rob in the book, but Rob's story has been told so many times. Like, I really like unearthing those stories that you don't hear that haven't been covered as much. That's really fun for me. And not to say that I don't love talking to Rob and interviewing Rob and telling a new chapter of his story, but when I can find something that hasn't been really talked about a lot, that people don't know a lot about, and introduce someone new to them, that's really what gets me fired up and going.
Yeah. I studied Japanese in college, and it was like really this was right after I got out of college that story with him making the Outlaws happened, and that was like such a cool thing for me to like hit on. So I love that was your story. When you read,
it's cool to see. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
It's
you're
also
good.
cool to see after the fact how far Japan has come in the international game. I did a weekly
Yeah.
cover for USA Lacrosse magazine, kind of out of the PLL making their trip to Japan, but the story kind of became this kind of more overarching history of Japan. And I know we'll talk about it a little later. I do plan on including it in my book, as my next book as well. But just the story of lacrosse in Japan, and how much they care about the sport, and how they view the sport. The saying is lacrosse makes friends. I think it's this community aspect that's really cool to see, and has kind of grown from getting to know Kai and tell his story, kind of accessing all these other stories as well.
Yeah, every time I see them play, it blows my mind that they don't play until like college. Like there's not youth lacrosse really in Japan. It's something you start at like the college kind of age level, and then these guys just dive. I almost hesitate to say this, but one of my favorite all-time movies is The Last Samurai, and he has a line about how from the moment they wake up, they dedicate themselves wholly to whatever it is they set out to do. And I always think of that line when I think of Japanese lacrosse, that these guys pick up their sticks at 18, 19 for the first time, and they just go head first into it. They just dedicate themselves wholly to being the best version of a player that they can be. And I don't know, I've just always loved that. It's always just like really resonated with me. So
Well, so for my next book, I interviewed someone, and he had a really interesting theory about kind of their growth, and aside from just the dedication, but lacrosse is the little brother of war, one of its nicknames. games.
Hmm.
And he talked about how, the samurai, just having the sword and their ability to use, their tool with their hands, and it kind of mirrors and mimics
Hmm.
using a lacrosse stick. So he said, that kind of history, it's not surprising that maybe they pick it up a little bit faster than others. Again,
Yeah.
the theory, and but it was an interesting one, and an interesting, if nothing else, just connection that he
Hmm.
came up with, that I thought kind of goes with what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about that, but that whole even if it's more of like a subconscious kind of like
Mhm.
connection that they make, that very well could be. When you read Major League Life in 2025 through the lens of the last 6 years and everything that has come to happen between the MLL and PLL, there's obviously you see it in a very different way, but I'm wondering how much of what ended up happening was kind of palpable in that moment, compared to what you can obviously see in retrospect. You open the book with just a litany of people basically saying the MLL is screwed, which at least in some manner did kind of come to pass. But how much of that was really palpable during the writing of this book, as opposed to just what we see now?
It's interesting because obviously with those comments from social media, the PLL was getting the hype, and the PLL also had the major stars. Rob Pennell and Lyle Thompson were still in the MLL, but a lot of the major stars had gone to the PLL. Paul Rabel, Tom Schreiber, Kyle Harrison, they had gone to the PLL. So there was this interesting juxtaposition, because the MLL was the league that had been around for nearly 20 years. The PLL was the one getting the buzz, and you could see from the very beginning why they were getting the buzz, just between the branding and the social push. Like, the MLL, kind of, we talked about, had this kind of way of, they weren't going to do the work to publicize the league. It was going to be that they'll make access available to the media, but it was going to be the media's job to push the league. It was going to be the players' job to push the league. It felt like they didn't do as great of a job in the publication of their league and their stars. So you could kind of see why the attention. Even, I remember at the time, there was so much pushback against the MLL, because they had moved all their games to I forget the name of the streaming service. I think it's Lacrosse TV now. It was something different before
It
that.
was Lax Sports Network,
Yes, yes,
LSN.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So they moved all the games to LSN, which I thought wasn't a bad move. I think maybe it was like $10 a month, but then you had all the games in one place, as opposed to prior to that, maybe there was a game on this network, there was a CBS network. It was on like 14 different networks. It's so difficult to figure out where you could find a game. So I thought it wasn't a bad move, but so many people complained about paying to watch the MLL. And then the PLL comes out, and most of their games, minus a few that got broadcast on NBC, most of theirs were on NBC Gold, which again was a paid streaming
Was
service.
paid.
Everybody's
Yeah.
like, I can't wait to purchase it. And I was like, you just wouldn't purchase the other thing.
Yeah.
Eventually, the games moved to Peacock, and then Peacock's got the WWE, and it's got The Office. So the value there was greater. But everybody was so pumped, and you could tell it was because of the way they were branding. But it was interesting because the first chapter in the book is Boston, and they were rocking that first game. They had a sold out crowd. There were people there. I got there to the game probably 2 or 3 hours before the game, because I knew I was going to be doing some interviews beforehand. I wanted to make sure I was there. I had nothing else to do. Not that there's nothing to do in Boston, but I knew I had gone for this purpose, so I wanted to make sure I was there early. And there were people. The parking lot was full. There were people there partying. They had a youth tournament going on. Like, it was a full house, and it was like, wow. What was crazy too is that first week of the PLL season was also at Gillette. So you
Hmm.
had that in the same area, and the crowd at the Cannons game was so great. So you're like, that's why I kind of say, I think I say something along the lines of, if this was the end of the MLL. Nobody told anybody in Boston because that place was rocking. Then of course the next week I went to Atlanta, and there I might have been able to count every person in the stands. So that was kind of disappointing, but it was kind of throughout the year this kind of roller coaster where you could see the momentum that the hype the PLL started with and the momentum they got. The first couple of weeks wasn't as sound as the product it is now. It wasn't as polished as it is, but by the time they got to that Baltimore weekend at Homewood, you could kind of feel that the PLL was taking off. And the MLL might have stuck around for a little longer, but I think COVID the following year in those bubble seasons, I think that was the ultimate, this is done. I think that expedited the process for sure.
Yeah. I remember that Boston game because they opened that new stadium in Quincy, right? It was that year. And yeah, I remember I was so excited about it because for me more lacrosse is good lacrosse. I loved that, kind of like you were saying earlier, that there were going to be guys who were getting to tell their stories that would not have gotten a chance without the kind of the two leagues. And there were going to be guys who got to be, to show that they could play. One thing I feel like maybe the PLL does a little bit better, at least it feels like from my perspective, is that some of those fringe guys do get kind of cycled through a little bit better. Whereas maybe in the MLL, you might go with the guy that you knew, the guy that played with you last year, instead of giving a new guy a shot. Whereas, training camps and stuff, I don't know, maybe that's just a feeling, but I all that to say, I really liked that for at least those 2 summers, we got to see, instead of even at the height of what the MLL was, a couple hundred guys, you were getting to see such a greater pool of guys. I remember tuning into that game and being like, oh, this is special. This is what Boston, I always felt like Boston could have been that, even at the height of, the Rabel years in Boston. I thought, man, if you guys weren't playing at Harvard Stadium and you played, there's something I think about playing at a packed 5,000 seat stadium that is unmatchable compared to fitting 10,000 people in a 40,000 seat stadium. Like it's not the same energy. It's not the same buzz. And that Boston game was a lot of fun. So
you're not wrong there. Talking to when the Boston Cannons, or I should say when the Cannons came back to Boston last year, and talking to some of the players about the return and talking about where should they play, because there were a ton of different options and you had a feeling it might be Gillette just because the PLL was so involved there. So many of the former players talk so fondly about those Harvard games. But you're not wrong about kind of the environment of a packed house in a smaller stadium, because I do think that's when you really saw we talk about the PLL that week in Baltimore when they were at Homewood. They had been playing in some giant venues previously, and that was one of the smaller venues that season, and that place was packed, and that was an electric crowd. I think they had an aerial photo that they took,
Yep.
Looked and felt really cool. So I agree 100%. Even I think back to I forget which year, I want to say 2022 championship, BC against UNC, the women's championship. I think the whichever one is the one that has the record for the most watched game on television. That wasn't in the big stadium that the men's teams were playing in. I think that was in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. If I am,
I want to say Homewood, but you might be right. I honestly can't remember.
I can't remember because I know they go to North Carolina a lot now. Maybe it was Homewood, but it was a smaller stadium like that. And watching that, you could feel the energy through the TV. And it, to me, that's one of the greatest games I think I've ever watched on television, and partially it's because of the environment. So I think that goes a long way for sure.
Yeah, You talked a little bit about you played soccer. I don't know if you're still a soccer guy. People that watch this show will know that I am. But that that was the first thing that ever just like got to me about watching like big time European soccer was the crowd, and just that the feeling of that crowd, that they're just constantly buzzing, they're chanting, they're singing and everything. And when that goal goes in and everybody just goes through the roof, like that was the thing. Even now I just gave myself goosebumps like just thinking about it. There's something about that energy that takes any regular game and just takes it up a notch or two or three, and can make a good game a great game, just like an iconic, and yeah, sitting in those half empty bowls, like you said, that first weekend in Gillette. I mean, they had a good crowd. My understanding was at least one of the games drew like 10,000 people, but you're in a 70,000 seat stadium. It feels like nobody's there. I'm sure you've been to games in Gillette. I went to the quarterfinals were in Gillette last year, and yeah, I mean, there probably were again about 10,000 ish people there. It didn't feel like it. It's such a cavern.
It becomes a perception problem too.
Yep.
I remember in the MLL too, even like the games at Hofstra, the crowd would be a solid crowd, but they would have the entire section, the camera would be focused on the main stands, and the entire other section would be completely empty because they didn't want it to look like it wasn't a packed house, because it gave that perception that no one was there. Even if the crowd was good, if they saw all the empty seats because the stadium was a little bit bigger, it was the perception that it wasn't as big of a deal, and then perception becomes reality. And it's like, well, look, no one's there, so it's not that big of a deal. When there was a good crowd, it's just too big of a space.
Yeah, and then you compare that to like Utah, which I think is about a 5,000 seat stadium, but they pack it, and everybody there is like into the game, and they're cheering, and especially when the Archers are playing. I think they're a pretty good crowd the rest of the games, but especially when the Archers are playing, and you go, oh yeah, like no, I see why they wanted to put a team here. Like it's great. It reads on TV really well. Like it's such a fun thing. Getting back to to the discussion before we go too far down that rabbit hole.
I could go down rabbit holes all day. It's pretty
Oh, I'm sure it won't be the last one we go down.
No, yeah.
What in your estimation then is that kind of what ultimately led to the MLL, was just kind of their reticence to do the things that ultimately the PLL did, but just generally that kind of needed to be done to run a sports league in this kind of internet age?
Yeah, probably. It's tough. I don't have all the answers, and I think it's kind of tough to come up with something different than, look, the PLLs, marketed the players in the league better. They're all over social. The games are easily available. Even, before it was on ESPN Plus, they were easily available to find. The merchandise was better in the PLL. Trying to find ML merchandise alone was, a challenge, and a very limited selection. It's just, I feel like it's a bunch of those little things that they just did almost all of them better. And I think I wonder how. I imagine some of it was finances, between who was, backing the league, and, did the ML have the investors that were patient enough? I think one of the interesting things that the PLL did that I thought was really interesting right away was the touring schedule. And I remember Paul Rabel saying from the very beginning, part of the reason they went to the touring schedule, one, was to make it more of an event. Like, hey, it's kind of like he references, I think, I forget what he references now, but it's like the WWE. Like, we are coming to your town this day, make sure you're there. That's part of it, but also the idea that instead of renting out 4 stadiums in one weekend, you're renting one stadium. So it
Mhm.
makes, and not only are you only renting one stadium, so paying for all those stadium rentals is cheaper, or it's not as expensive, but you also then have all of your talent in one place. So
Mhm.
you don't need to have all these different film people and things like that. Like, they capture all the action, and you can
Mhm.
get all the interviews done. Like, right, you're not spreading your resources, which is something that when he mentioned that when they first formed, I thought that was really, really smart. I know they've talked about moving eventually to home and away schedules and things like that. But and if they're going to have more teams, they're going to have to do that, because you
Mhm.
can't have that many games on one weekend.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I think the touring schedule, as much as people want that home and away schedule, I think it really is smart.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And I don't think that people us- uh, they probably understand it better now, although I still think that there are a lot of people that just don't quite grasp why it's such a good concept, and the fact that yeah, you got to pay 4 stadium rentals. You got to have 4 totally separate staffs. Like you
Mhm.
basically have to quadruple your staff. Oh, my internet's crapping again. Am I good?
Yeah, you're back.
I got the little symbol. I'm telling you, it's only when I try to run this thing. If I record myself, it does totally fine. But I don't know.
Uh,
So yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the touring model was such a good idea, and I think it continues to at this stage still be a good idea. I like that they kind of split the difference. They've put teams in home cities, so now you can start rooting for your home city. They needed to get that transition over with, but I think they still have at least another couple of years on this touring model before they really kind of truly settle down. I'm curious from your perspective because I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking you might be one of the foremost experts on the MLL, at least in terms of people that will actually come out and talk about it. Brennan Kelly might technically be a better expert, but I don't think he's coming out and talking about it. So you might be one of the more foremost experts on the MLL right now, and given your history with the league, the connections that you had with the league, and all that stuff, what was it a very difficult transition for you personally to kind of bridge this thing, or did you just kind of have to go with the flow, or how'd that work?
no, I don't think it was difficult for me to do, at least. I think you could see the direction it was going, and I think I've had conversations with Spencer Ford about it too, who's now the GM of the Chaos. He was all in the ML. He was an ML original, but you've got to have those lines of communication open, because you never know what could happen down the line. And what happened down the line was the ML didn't exist anymore, but because he had those relationships with people that were in the PLL, it wasn't like it was the end of the road for him in professional lacrosse. For me, for as much as I covered the MLL in depth and I wrote a book about it, I did still cover the PLL in that first year, not as on big of a on big as excuse me, not as on big of a platform. I was covering the MLL for USA Lacrosse Magazine. They had Jack Goods covering the PLL, but I was still covering the PLL for New England Lacrosse Journal, and interviewing about different things and different players. And Brent Adams was one that I would talk to frequently. So I still was involved, and I still had connections. And even I remember I was interviewing Finn Sullivan, who was had been in on the Outlaws, moved to the PLL, I think in the second season in 2020, was on the Redwoods. And I remember talking to him, and him talking about how he still would watch the MLL and he'd read the stuff about the MLL. So I think the kind of tribalism came more so, it was more so an online kind of thing. Like in terms of covering the league or being a part of the league, if you had connections, if you had relationships with people, you still had those relationships. And I know a lot of people, when the two leagues merged, when the PLL bought the MLL, a lot of people were happy that they could talk about their experiences. I remember that was one of the conversations I'd had with Nat St. Laurent, because he cherished his time as an assistant coach on the Ohio Machine. And that was his first break into professional lacrosse. And he was happy that, he didn't have to watch what he had to say about his time there. Like, he could just freely talk about his experience. So I think it was kind of a welcome transition for everybody when everything was under one roof again. Is it unfortunate that, I think at the time there were 12 teams and now we're back up to 8, that's great. Whereas at the time of when they merged, it was 7. But either way, you're still going down from that 12 teams, and everybody wants expansion because there's so many good players in the pool. But, so that stinks. But in terms of covering the league, in terms of being a part of the league or telling stories, I think that it was an easy transition.
Yeah, I guess I've kind of forgotten about it until you said it. Like, just the level of animosity on both sides, like, and like you said, just not even, I don't know if it was really like a handed down kind of mandate, but certainly most people felt like they couldn't talk realistically about the other. And if you were a PLL player, like you were saying, Finn, and you're watching MLL games, it's not like you could tweet about and be like, oh man, this was awesome, because there was just such an animosity on both sides going at each other that seemed to clear up.
And part of it too, like you said, I'm not going to say I don't know if there was a clear mandate, do not talk about the other league. But part of it too is just, that's the company you work for, and they were competitors. Like, are you really going to build up your competitor in order to, because you've got a friend on the other team, right? Or are you going to talk glowingly about your time with the Machine when you're now in the other league coaching? I think it was just one of those kind of, this is the company I work for, I need to talk nicely about the company I work for, and we're just not going to bring it up.
Yeah, I'm laughing really hard right now because I've been trying so hard to save it for the end, but I just can't. But I know that you are probably also thinking about wrestling here, because I know that you're a wrestling guy, and that is such a huge thing in wrestling, and that like you don't really talk about the other company because you don't work for them anymore, and you don't want to put them in the minds of your audience of be like, oh, what's happening over there on that other channel, on that other show or whatever. It's like the third, and it was making me laugh because it's like the third time that I've been like, oh, this would be such a good place to talk about wrestling.
There's, I was gonna, when you introduced me, I was gonna say we're here to talk about John Cena's heel turn, right? And the road to WrestleMania, but. No, it's so true.
I see you're a fan of the show.
There's so many parallels that it's really interesting. But yeah, it's 100% that. And I one of the podcasts I listen to aside from the Run Out is the SI Media podcast with Jimmy Traina, and he had MJF on the show, and they talked about kind of WWE because MJF is friends with Cody Rhodes, and they were talking about that, and it came up, and he's like, of course I'm watching WWE. Any professional wrestler that tells you they're not watching WWE, even if they don't work for them, is lying to you, because if you're a true fan and you're a true professional for their sakes, of course you're watching to see what other people are doing, and you've got relationships with people and other companies that you want them to do well. So yeah, absolutely. And it's in the book, Major League Life as well. Like Spencer Ford talked about how he's got relationships with Kyle Harrison and other guys that were in the PLL, and that if they needed something from him, they knew they could call him. And if he needed something, he knew he could call them. Like, just because they worked in opposite companies didn't mean they weren't watching each other, didn't mean they weren't rooting for each other. It was just, this is who I'm working for. So the wrestling parallel is 100% there. I thought about it so much that 2019 season. It was interesting. It was obvious, and it's really there. And guess who else is a big wrestling fan? Paul Rabel, huge
Oh, I
wrestling fan,
know.
who's had conversations with Triple H, Paul Levesque, and Stephanie McMahon. So there's some business sense there that he's picked up along the way.
I know every single time that something even remotely controversial comes on, everybody comes into my mentions talking about how Paul's treating it like the WWE and he's fixing things. And I'm like, no, just because he likes wrestling doesn't mean he's fixing his sports league. Like, come on, this is ridiculous. It's not how this works. But
I remember that first season, that 2019 season. If you remember, there was the fight between the Redwoods and the Chaos, and I think Blaze reared and body slammed Nick Casello or something like that. And there was a lot of talk about that. Maybe I'm remembering in reverse, whatever it was. But the specifics, but there was a lot of talk about, was it good to have the fighting? Was it not good? And, who were they catering to? Or so there was a lot of conversation. And I remember kind of at the time, the kind of sentiment from the PLL was kind of like, they're talking about us. That's great. And I remember, I think that following weekend, Paul Rabel tweeted a picture of himself at a WWE event. It was like, I hear we like fighting or something like that. Kind of like a wink at everybody. That's just something that stood out that I remember for some weird reason.
I think we'll have to have you back and we'll just have a whole episode about lacrosse and wrestling parallels.
I will say I've got it's an ebook of essays. After I wrote my first book, I still wanted to write. I still was like, I want to do more books later on, but I didn't want to do something big. But I still had these random weird ideas that came up while I was traveling and things. So I just wrote some essays and I put them in an ebook that's still available. But one of the things was, picking out which lacrosse players would be the best wrestlers. So I have those. I kind of compare them to, the wrestlers of the times and everything, and who would be who. So that's definitely something I think about quite a bit. More than ever.
That is a good transition. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was, I know that you are working on a new book. My understanding is that it hits at least somewhat close to home for me specifically, and I wondered what updates you had on that, what you wanted to share with the group about that, because I know I'm pretty excited about it.
Sure. Yeah, I've talked about it a little bit. I think I've talked less about it lately just because it's been going on for a little while and it's just taken me longer to do. But I am working on my second book. It is about the connections between lacrosse and the military. It was, again, one of those things, when I wrote a book, I wanted to do something kind of a bigger concept that tied a bunch of small threads together. And that was one where it was just, you're thinking of these ideas and you see the success that Navy and Army have. And it's different, the success they have in lacrosse than they have in other places. And it's like, well, why are they having the success that other places have? And then you start thinking about, well, how the championship is on Memorial Day. No one else has their college championship on Memorial Day. And how a lot of the players, a lot of the hotbeds, if you think about it, are, you think about 9/11, right? A lot of people were affected that were from the New York area or from the DMV area, and how that kind of affected their thought process. So that's kind of where the idea started from. And it's just been talking to people and exploring their stories. There were so many pros that could play that were from the military academies. There were players that played at schools like Duke and Syracuse and could do anything in their lives and decided to then go into service. So it was, why are those relationships? And I've mentioned when I've emailed or reached out to people, the concept of the book and trying to get interviews, that maybe I'm just seeing it because the echo chamber that I live in is lacrosse, but it feels like those connections are stronger with lacrosse in the military than other sports. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but between the players that have gone pro, the players that have gone from a Duke to the military, from organizations like Shootout for Soldiers and Soldiers to Sidelines that use the game of lacrosse really as the medicine game to help veterans. I just think there's so many connections, and it's been really cool to explore. And part of the reason that it's taking so long, one, is because just the nature of the book. When I wrote Major League Life, it was, I'm going to travel to these games. I'm going to get the story at these games. And it was very kind of chronological. I would go do the interviews, and then I'd be in the hotel. And instead of going out, I'd be like, all right, I'm just going to start drafting this. And this book is not like that. Maybe I want to work on the chapter about Brendan Looney, but I still haven't gotten these couple interviews. So now I can do, but I've got the interviews for the story about the players from the military academies that have gone on to play pros, right? I've got all those interviews I want. It's also been one that's kind of spider webbed. Every interview, I feel like I've talked to someone, they're like, this is a really cool concept. You know who you should talk to. And they refer me to someone else. And it's like, all right, well, now I've got this other interview that's really exciting, and a whole new story kind of opens up. So it's been a lot of expanding universe style things. But I also want to make sure that I give it the proper attention and time it deserves. So I haven't been rushing it. I've wanted to make sure I was doing it and had all the thoughts organized. I also, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a dad of two, and my daughter is 3.5. My son just turned 1 last week. Finding time to write with them is pretty hard. But we've talked about a schedule. They're going to stay in daycare some days over the summer, and over the summer when they go to daycare, that's going to be my time to write my book, because I also won't have my teaching responsibilities, my coaching responsibilities. My time will free up a little bit. So this summer is the season where I am going to really be hammering down and trying to finish this book. So hopefully I have something ready to go sometime in the fall. Hopefully that's my goal.
Okay, yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Is there any kind of, I'm not gonna hold you to it. I know how these things go, but is there any kind of idea of when it would be coming? Because, like I said, I'm looking forward to it. But I totally get it. I got married about a year ago, and that has completely changed all timetables. That I haven't put out an episode in 2.5 weeks because we've been doing stuff, and that's not even, I don't have kids, so like I don't even have that level, and I'm still like, I was actually thinking about it earlier this week about like, man, when I was like a single man, like I could do this stuff, I could just pump this stuff out. And I'm like, yeah, well, because I just don't have the time. So I can somewhat empathize with that, I guess a little bit. To some degree anyway.
Well,
but I am
certainly to a degree. But, I always say I wear a lot of different hats, writing both books and articles, coaching, teaching. But the job that I want to be the best at is being the best husband and dad. And I certainly don't always fulfill that, whether it's just because time obligations. Last week we kind of held off on this. A little behind the curtain. You and I had talked about doing this, and I said last week, it was like, I've got 3 games that I was coaching, 3 games in 4 nights, which I hate that schedule.
yeah.
Director would do something about that, but we had 3 games in 4 nights. We were getting ready for my son's first birthday party. I just am teaching during the day. Like, I did not have the time to do an interview, but the coaching thing was hard too, because it's, we had 2 games. I live about an hour away from where I coach and where I teach. We commute. Yeah, my wife and I commute. It's one of the, being in Virginia, it's one of those things where, where we got jobs, it's a little pricey to get a house. So,
yeah.
We moved a little bit further away. And when we got the house, it was just the 2 of us. And we were like, okay, it's fine. But, not to go down another rabbit hole, but it would be, I went 2 days without seeing my kids, awake, other than in a FaceTime, because, we got up, they got them ready for school. I went to school. I taught. I went to my game. I got home after 11 o'clock, went to bed, and then it was the same thing the next day. I think the next day, actually, my wife stayed home because she was getting ready for the party, and which meant she took the kids to school a little bit later. So they woke up later, which meant they weren't awake by the time I left the house. And then I had another game where I didn't get it. We went to overtime. I got home after 11 and they were already asleep. So it was 2 days that I didn't get to see them. So sometimes, you feel a little guilty and it's tough, but you also try to do the things that you enjoy as well and know that, hey, this, any kind of paycheck that I get from coaching, we're going to go on a vacation and we're going to do something fun together, you know? So you try to put that in your brain too. So, but that's the job that I try to do the best at, or I want to be the best at. So, especially where the book is going to be self-published. I had some interest from a publisher, and this again going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I had some interest from a publisher who was actually interested in Major League Life, but at the time, with COVID and everything, when I published it, there people weren't working and things like that. But she reached out, and I sent this idea of the book about the military, and it went to the publisher. It went, went to her. She was the editor, and she brought it to the board, and the board, she got back to me and she said, the board loves your writing style. They love the idea, but there's no money in lacrosse books right now. So they're passing. So I'm self-publishing it, which, actually has an advantage that I don't have a timeline. So I can, get more interviews, and I can really kind of key in on specific works and expand it when I feel like it needs to. So as long as it's kind of drawn out, which is why I don't want people to get sick of, or not get sick of, but when they hear me say, oh, I got a new book coming out, they're like, yeah, we've been hearing this for 3-4 years now. I don't want that kind of reaction. So that's probably why I don't talk about it as much. But I'm definitely hoping, I'm seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm hoping to really get some focus on it.
Yeah, no, that's good. Like I said, I totally get it. In fact, I was talking to my wife the other day about, half joking. It's a truth, but it's not like the end of the world. But I was talking to her, about how I hadn't watched any basketball lately. Mm-hmm. And she was like, do you really like basketball? And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I grew up in North Carolina. Like, you think I don't like basketball? What? Uh-huh. I was like, Duke basketball was like my life. I thought I was going to go to Duke and play basketball and go to the NBA. Like, Duke basketball was everything to me. And even with as good as we've been, we just made the Final Four. I haven't watched a game all year. And I was like, a big part of that is because my wife is just not a sports person. She goes with me to games. When the PLL is on, she will sit down and watch it with me because she knows that's such a big thing for me. But the flip side of that was that I love my wife and I want to spend time with her and I want to do things that she enjoys. And so I've had to pare down the things that I watch and the things that I do because that's worth it to me. Giving up Duke basketball is worth it to me to be with my wife and stuff. So all that to say, I understand the idea of like, the job I want to be the best at, like you said, I love the way that you said that. The job that I want to be the best at is being a good husband to my wife. And if that means I give up, right now, my mom, oh, that's terrible. My wife works at a newspaper about an hour and a half away. And so she goes up there twice a week, stays the night. Her sister lives in that town, so she stays with her sister. And so the weekends this lacrosse season have been about the only time we really get together. Yep. So I've been watching. I throw on games now during the week while I'm working because I work from home. I work at my desk, and I throw on games on my second screen, and that's when I watch. It's part of the reason why the run out tends to come out later in the week is because I like to be able to sit down and at least watch a handful of the kind of bigger important games so that I'm not just spouting stuff off. But yeah, I get it. It's not an easy thing to do. And again, especially I don't have kids. I can't even comment on that level. I know they are a handful. I lived with my sister for a little while and she has 3, and and they're of an age where they did a lot of their stuff to themselves. You know, they took care. They're the oldest one's like just about to break into high school. So, you know, they did a lot of their dressing and showering and bathing and getting themselves to school and stuff. And even that still was such an eye-opening thing about just how much time they take. But let's come out of this rabbit hole for just a little bit.
I'll just end it there too by saying,
go ahead.
I'm also not complaining. Like,
right.
I love it. It's great. Do I, like you said, maybe I'm watching a PLL game during on Monday instead of on Saturday or Sunday? Sure. Are we, instead of watching an NCAA tournament game, which my wife is a sports fan, she would watch it with me.
Yeah.
But instead of us watching an NCAA tournament game, are we watching, I don't know, Moana? Absolutely. But I do love it. So I don't want to come off like I'm complaining either.
You know what? I am thankful that my wife has really gotten into wrestling. She loves it. She's gotten so into it. So that's another thing that we watch. Like, one of the things that we do every week is we sit down and we watch Raw and we watch SmackDown, and then we watch PLEs when they happen and stuff. So yeah, that's been great for me because we have so much fun watching that together. It's something that we're both really into. In fact, 1 year ago yesterday, we were watching them in Manchester in New Hampshire on the road to WrestleMania. It was so much fun. Anyway, back to lacrosse for a little bit. As we mentioned earlier, you are now the PLL beat writer for the California Redwoods. And pretty much from the moment you took the job, you haven't had to search for a story, have you?
No, not at all. It's really funny.
It's just like one thing after another.
Yeah, so that also is another reason why the book isn't getting done, because watching around the league, it's like I have had to do a lot of heavy lifting lately on the beat writer staff. Somebody said the other day, one of the stories I tweeted about, and somebody said, they were a Redwoods fan, and they're like, "We've got the best beat writer. This is a reason why." And I was like, I really appreciate that, but I have had to do a lot of work, right? Like, you wouldn't be saying that if maybe I was writing for like, I don't know, who's a team that hasn't had too much action, like the Archers, they haven't done much in the off season. I don't know if you're saying I'm the best beat writer if I'm covering them. So I have to give a little credit to my source material. It has been nonstop.
Nonstop.
It was really funny because I even said it to my editor. I thought I was going really, like, they made that kind of sprint in the beginning of the offseason with their player movement signings, bringing in Ronan Jacoby and Marquez White and Jackson Morrill and Ryan Oghaven. And after I did a story for each one of those. And after I did that, I was like, okay, I think they're going to be slowing down now. And then the news about Nat came out, and I messaged my editor. And I was like, man, like, I got more to do now. Like, that was just an appetizer. This is even bigger.
Yeah, because that's not even like hey, we signed this guy. Like, there's some. In fact, let's just get into it. What is your read on what happened? Because I just can't imagine that was a plan at for very long. It felt like it was maybe had a 24-hour notice of like, hey, we're pulling it. So what is your read on what happened and how we ended up where we ended up?
It's interesting. I wouldn't say it was planned, but I also, I think, over time the seeds do kind of happen, and I think some of it is family based. You know, we talked about wanting to be there for our families, and Nat, above so many people, is a great family guy. And I think, you know, there's, you know, wanting to be with the family and you know, things like that. I think that's part of it. I think just he was really excited about the players that he was bringing in. But I think there's just it just, I don't know. It's tough to say. It's tough to say because it was surprising to everyone. It was surprising to me, and I was at that time talking to him pretty regularly with the guys. Um, you know, I think some of the backlash on social media just kind of, it's like, what am I doing this for? You know, if I had to take myself in his shoes, like so many people when that Chris Gray stuff came out, immediately, without even thinking, just went to, this is Nat's fault. It's because Nat's the coach. And if it were me, that would bother me. So I don't know, you know, I have to wonder if some of that kind of just was like, I don't need to be doing this. I don't know. I think some of it might have been, there needs to be a new voice to help this team grow. You know, I will say that I know that Nat was really proud of his players, and Nat was really proud of the opportunity he had to coach a professional team. Right, that was his goal for a really long time, and he's got other goals and he's got other things that he wants to do, but that was a goal. And so I think he certainly was very happy to have the experience. And you know, when I talked to him after he stepped down, there definitely was a sense of peace with the decision. Like, he made the decision. It wasn't anybody else that made the decision for him. He made the decision, and it was a decision that he made peace with and he was happy with. And I think at the end of the day, that's the best thing for anyone, is when you have control over the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I said I think on this show, I've said it in tweets, like, Nat is one of the best people in the game, like, bar none. So, you know, I hope nothing but the best for him. I hope, I know he loves, I just blanked on his school. Ohio Northern. Okay. I was like, it's ONU or something. Yeah. Ohio Northern. I know he loves that school, but I would love to see him, you know, take a higher profile job. So just so we could, you know, he was more in the public lacrosse space more, you know, if that's what he wants to do, obviously, if he's, I know he's happy where he is.
Start watching that level too now, though, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe people will start watching that level to get more into his space. Why should he change to other people's spaces? People should come to his space. He's the marquee draw. No, and he's really proud of his team there too. He's done a lot of great stuff. Yeah, it's definitely, it's interesting because in all the time that I've had covering professional lacrosse, you see coaches come and go. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of the coaches have been really good with me. I know I wrote it, but I haven't seen any other thank you name coach here articles for any other coach in however many years of professional lacrosse coverage. The fact that you could have that many players talk so glowingly about him, the fact that that was a story concept, it was an idea that was in the back of my head, but I didn't want to be the first one to say it. But the fact that other people were like, I think this is a good story. I'm like, yes, yeah, good. That's the one I want to write. You know, I think that speaks to how people felt about him and, you know, the loss that the PLL will have this year. You know, that's not to say anything negative about Joe Spallina or Anthony Kelly. You know, very excited to have those two in the league as well. And again, we talk about MLL, that go back years covering Spallina before his Lizards teams were the Superstar Galacticos, to bring back the soccer reference. They're going to be great, and they've got people fired up. But you know, Nat was obviously a special person in the league, and his players, you know, kind of wanted to tell that.
Yeah. Yeah. Before your article came out, it was something that I keyed on when the news dropped and people started tweeting messages. I was like, yeah, this isn't this isn't something you often see in lacrosse. You might see it in some other sports, especially with a guy who was like a Phil Jackson or someone who was a long serving, long winning coach. And when you think about Nat was essentially a head coach for 6 years, it's just not something that you see a lot. And then your piece came out, and I thought it showed even more the level of love that not just players he coached, but players that played against him were saying, about him. I just thought spoke volumes about who he was as a person. You mentioned Joe Spallina and Anthony Kelly. Joe Spallina was hired as the GM, Anthony Kelly as the new head coach, and I know you know Joe fairly well. I'm imagining you have some experience with Anthony Kelly a little bit as well through the MLL. What should anyone who maybe wasn't around for the MLL days or just doesn't have a good firm grasp on who those two are, what should they know about these two hires?
So the Spallina one, we're already seeing it, but Spallina, and it's actually really funny because I see a lot of similarities between the way they operate between Nat St. Laurent and Joe Spallina, but Joe Spallina will literally do anything to make his team better. Anything to make his team better. And he will kick the tires on any player, any pick. He's willing to do whatever it takes. I think you got to look at 2012. The Lizards had just come off a terrible season. He's named the head coach of the team, but the amount of talent that was leaving Long Island. John Grant Jr. left. His own brother, Brian Spallino, who's the winningest player of all time, he left. Matt Danowski had just got, I think, traded to the Charlotte Hounds.
Charlotte, yeah.
There were so many players that were leaving. They had the number one pick in the draft, who they selected. They used to select Rob Pennell, who had another year of eligibility at Cornell, and he took that extra year of eligibility. So they don't even have, the parity play of that number one pick to help improve their team. So they've got all these holes left by great talents in the game. And what does he do? He drafts Tommy Palasek. He trades for Matt Gibson. He picks up Brian Langtry out of the player pool. And that team goes to the playoffs that year. And that sets the wheels in motion to the point where in 2015, they've got, like I mentioned, the Galacticos. They bring in Ned Crotty. They bring in Paul Rabel. They've got Rob Pennell. They bring back Brian Spallina. They've got Kyle Hartzell. They've got this just superstar team that wins the championship. But that 2012 team, I think, shows what he can do. And in my Q&A that we did for the PLL, we talked about this. But that 2012 team shows what he's been able to do with teams like that need a touching up, need a little refurbishing, need a little just help or growth or just change of pace. Even 2012, the Lizards already had Greg Garemlian on the team, but he was a backup during his first year or so. And he's talked about it on your show. But when Joe Spallina becomes the head coach, Joe Spallina makes Greg Garemlian the starter, and that becomes kind of the superhero origin story of an eventual MVP, best face-off player in professional lacrosse history. So he's good evaluator of talent. He's able to draft players. If you look at the Wizards draft history, whether they played for him or didn't play for him, he's picked some guys not only at the top of the rounds, like a Rob Pennell or a Joe Fletcher that were USA lacrosse players, but guys in round 3, round 4, round 5 that were really, really all-star level contributors. So he's able to draft. He's able to make trades. Obviously, he's pulled in some great trades. He identifies talent on the player pool. So he is just a really incredible talent evaluator. And I think, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays with the Redwoods. And Anthony Kelly, he's known as a an elite face-off guy from his time in his playing days. I think what wasn't really known was his experience coaching. We talked about how he's basically been coaching since he was 20. He gets out of college and he's helping a local high school, but he does have experience as an assistant coach, at Harvard and Ohio State. He coaches, he formulated Resolute Lacrosse. So he's got a lot of experience coaching, and he actually helped the USA box team this past fall. So he's going to bring some of those, and he won, I think, bronze himself as a member of that team when he played. So he's going to bring some of those elements that you don't necessarily think of, but he's going to bring some of those, I think, box elements along with some other elements as well.
Okay. I like that. I didn't know. I do know Joe Spallina. I think most anyone who was around in the MLL days, especially you call them the Galacticos. I've always called them the Monstars that roster. And then they win that championship, and then they go get Will Manny, and you're like, are you kidding me right now? Yep. But I didn't know a ton about Anthony Kelly, so good to know. I didn't know the box stuff, so that's good to know. We'll talk about the departures before we get to some of the arrivals. I think RP3 was at least somewhat expected to be leaving, and even to an extent, Chris Gray. I don't know that you would say expected, but not exactly a surprise when he left. But IDA leaving, Holden Garlant retiring, and even the Owen Grant trade, although we'll get to probably the good side of that later, were all surprises of at least some degree. Is there any worry about the veteran leadership on this team, especially when you look at the guys that left and the guys that are left, and you see that, none of them are locker room issues in any way, but you seem to be running out of locker room leaders per se. Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of worry about that, you think?
I don't think so. It's certainly a fair question, because those are, captains. Those are, especially when you look at Pinnell and IDA, and the year before with the retirement of Eddie Glazner. Definitely those were guys that people looked up to. But I think you've got Westberg, who has kind of been a quiet leader of this team. I think TD Erlin, as it's his spot as one of the best face-off guys in the league, is quickly becoming a leader, and he's been there for several years now. I think, Ryder Garnsey in his own right, he's been there. This will be year 7 for him with the Redwoods, and he's a college coach at Notre Dame. I think he's going to be asked to be a leader. I think they have guys that, have been together. It's a young team. I think that's part of the reason why they brought in Dylan Malloy as well, because he is a veteran as well. But they've got for as young as they are, they do have some veterans.
Yeah. Yeah. And the flip side of that, like you said, they brought in, I hesitate to say sneaky good, because I think you can look at this roster and be like, no, these are some good players that they're picking up. But in a lot of ways, it is kind of a sneaky good, especially like you mentioned, there was that first kind of rush and you thought, okay, these are some good pickups. And then they've just, like, since Spallina got there, it's been like, pickup after pickup, and they picked up, like you said earlier, Ryan Ogevin. They picked up Jackson Morrow, both from the Archers. Got Marquez White and Aiden Denenza from the player pool. Duke guy Aiden Denenza. I'm glad about that. Both look like they could be very good short stick defensive middies for this team, especially with guys like IDA leaving. Ronan Jacoby and Dylan Malloy from the Atlas, and then most recently got Brandon Nickturn from the Outlaws. It feels like overnight this team went from one where depth was probably one of the weaknesses of the team to where depth might be one of the kind of strengths of this team. They maybe don't have the heights of some of the other teams. Ryder Garnsey's probably the big star currently on this roster, but I mean, you look at it, it feels like all of a sudden they went from having one or two guys on this roster to having like 8 like pretty solid choices for especially on that offensive end down there.
And they're going to have the second pick, the third pick, that
Yeah.
you've got to imagine they're taking on offense, and possibly the 10th pick in the draft that they might use on an offensive guy. I don't know. I definitely one or two of those picks will be offensive players. Yeah, looking at the roster, I was kind of like counting players. I'm like, who's going to get left off this 19?
Yeah. Yep.
But I think that's something, again, it goes back to that 2012 Lizards team. But I think and part of this was before Joe Spallina came on board as well. But there's a lot of players that are looking for opportunity. And I think there's a lot of guys that are hungry, and that's kind of some of what they're collecting here, right? Like guys that they haven't been the go-to guy. They haven't been maybe a roster every week, but they've been fighting for spots. They've had big moments and they've shown they can contribute. Well, now you're going to get an opportunity to be that starter, to be on the lineup all, 10 weeks. Ryan Oghaven is a guy that because of the depth of that Archers team, didn't get action every week. But 2 years ago, when they win their first championship, he's scoring a 2-pointer that gives them the lead that they hold until the fourth quarter. Jackson Morrill bounced around the past couple of years with multiple trade deadline deals in one of each of the last 2 years. But when Brendan Nichtern, who they just acquired, when he can't be with the Chrome anymore because of his military obligations, interviewed him for my book. Who's the guy that fills in for Brendan Nichtern? It's Jackson Morrill. And he had a really good showing for that Chrome team. And the reason they traded him to begin with was because the next year the team did terrible, and it was like what you see in baseball. Like, okay, we're going to send a guy that has value to another team to get a pick in what was the greatest draft of all time. It wasn't because they didn't want Jackson Morrill. It wasn't because he couldn't play. It was because he had value. And I think that's kind of what they're doing with these guys is they're getting guys that have value, but that maybe, haven't been the Rob Pennell, the star of the show, but that are hungry for their opportunity for more.
Well, and like you pointed out, you have the second and third because of that Owen Grant trade. You have that second and third pick this next month's draft, and it's assumed that CJ Kirst is going to be the number 1 pick and will not be available. Sort of 2 questions. The first one is, what do you feel the Redwoods that Joe Spallina and Anthony Kelly are maybe leaning towards looking at? And then the second part of that question is maybe what you would do with especially those first 2 picks. If you want to spread it out into 10 as well, go for it.
I think it's safe to assume or infer or guess that one of those first 2 picks, the 2 or the 3, doesn't really matter. I don't think, other than salary purposes. I have to imagine one of them's Andrew McAdory. The midfield did need some help. They've got Ronan Jacoby. They've got Ryan Oghaven that they brought in this offseason. But could use more scoring from that midfield. They have a lot of midfielders that are big, powerful, downhill dodgers. McAdory is going to give them a little bit more electricity, a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more excitement and speed. But you also look, who are the first 2 official signings for the Redwoods during Spallina's tenure? Vince Dialto and Aiden Denenza, 2 players that he's coached at the youth level that he knows very well. Who's another player that fits that bill? Andrew McAdory. Even the signing of Dylan Malloy, he's a Long Island guy. He was the GM of the Lizards in 2019 when they signed Dylan Malloy. He's bringing in people that he knows, that he trusts, and I think McAdory is one of those guys. From there, what they do with the other picks, I imagine they're still going to go offense. I think this is going to be, as much as they've brought in players, they're happy with the defense, and maybe later in the draft they grab a defenseman to add some depth. Don't forget they have Cole Kastner coming in, who didn't play last year because he was going to be playing basketball this year. He's going to be coming back this summer, so that's like adding another first-round pick on the defensive end. I imagine they still go offense, and it's just whoever wins the jobs wins the jobs. Whoever wins the roster spots wins the roster spots. Where they go, I don't know. The first PLL mock draft by Adam Lamberti, he had them before the trade picking Sam King at the 10 spot. I don't know if Sam King gets to the 10 spot. Maybe they get an extra pick to get Sam King at the 3rd spot. So they have a natural ex-attackman. And he's certainly a talented player. I could see them going that route. Bringing in Dylan Malloy and Brendan Nickturn, they have guys that could play that spot along with Jackson Morrill. I think, so maybe they go with it. Chris Kavanaugh, he seems like kind of in a similar vein of Malloy and Nickturn, a tough player. Spalina was recently on the Mitchell Pelkey show and talked about his affinity for the Kavanaugh family. I mean, again, we're talking about relationships. It sounds like he kind of likes what that family stands for and the way they do things. And not for nothing, we talked about it. Ryder Garnsey is a coach. Where is he a coach? At Notre Dame. Who does he know really well? He knows one of his best friends in pro lacrosse is Matt Kavanaugh, his brother, so those relationships do mean something. So if I had to guess, and I don't have the inside information on this yet, they're playing their cards a little close on the draft. But if I had to guess, my guess would be Chris Kavanaugh, because you could play him at a few different spots and try some different things with him. So that would be my guess.
Yeah, that was one of my thoughts when the trade happened and they got 2 and 3. I'm not even sure that I can fully articulate why, but my first kind of immediate thought was, I have a feeling that this was not necessarily that this was a trade to make this happen, but because they now are in this spot, that, I would see someone like you said, an Andrew McAdory or, Sam English or someone that can be in the midfield, and then Chris Kavanaugh, who could run in the midfield, but I think typically most of us think he'll be at attack somewhere. But I had that same sort of feeling that there was something about it that just reeked of, we want Chris Kavanaugh to me. I don't know why. I can't fully articulate it, but there was just something about it.
And it's that kind of feeling too, like when they just had the 2nd pick, it was kind of like Pat Kavanaugh last year, right? It was going to be Brendan O'Neill. It was going to be Connor Schellenberger. And then for so long, so many people had, Pat Kavanaugh in there at 3rd. And he wound up sliding a little bit. And it felt kind of like this was kind of like, at the beginning, everybody had CJ Kirst and Chris Kavanaugh. But it was like, do the Redwoods would they really be better off with Kavanaugh versus like a McAdory or someone, but then when you've got 2 picks, it's like, okay, well, now we can just go after anyone and everyone. I will say Joe Spalina says it puts them in a position now to get the best player available, and they don't have to worry about filling a need, or more so they can just grab the best player, and it's just going to be who they think is the best player. I will say I don't think they go defense though, purely for the part of why would you trade Owen Grant for the 3rd pick if you're gonna then take the 3rd pick and use it on a defender. That logic doesn't. I'm sure there's a way, especially Coach Spalina. He knows how to talk, and he's got a vision in mind. If that was his vision, I'm sure there's a way he would rationalize it. My brain, it doesn't see it that way.
No, I'm with you there. I don't see that really being a thing either. And like I said, we'll see what happens next month, but it just, from the moment that trade came through, I was like, this feels like Chris Kavanaugh's a Redwood. I don't like you were saying, it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, but something about it just says to me Chris Kavanaugh. And then I think the more interesting question is, who's that other pick? Is it McAdory, who makes so much sense for so many reasons that you very well laid out. But then, even if it's not him, it feels like it's some kind of a guy they can play out of the midfield. And like you said, especially, I do like the idea of Andrew McAdory because of, if Dylan Malloy's been running out of the box for both Atlas and Chrome at times. So, depending on how you work that out, he's still going to be something different than just about everyone else that's on that roster in the midfield. So yeah, no, that could be fun. Last PLL question here is going to be on this side of the draft. And just like I said about the book, I'm not going to hold you to it because we still have the draft and training camp and 100 other ways that this whole season could change between now and the end of 2025. What are expectations for this team, given where we are right now?
If you ask Coach Spallina, he said it to me multiple times. He said it in the media multiple times. The expectation is to win a championship, right? Like, that's why you're playing pro lacrosse. That's why you're in it. And there's no reason why he can't do that. And I think that also, like we've talked about, that 2012 team, nobody expected that team to get to the playoffs except for that team, and they did it. Do I know if this is a championship winning team? I don't know. I wouldn't put anything past them, that's for sure, and I wouldn't do that. But, there's clearly, you've got the Archers are built to succeed, and the Atlas are built to succeed. There's a lot of heavy hitters. Can this team make the playoffs? Especially with the way the new format is, they've only got to beat one team in their conference. You've got the Archers, you've got the Outlaws, and you've got the Chaos. To get into the playoffs, they have to beat one of those teams. I think that's certainly achievable. I think this could be a playoff team, especially with the additions they have. And that hunger to prove people wrong about their careers, that hunger to take advantage of the opportunities, and the hunger that has existed to kind of rectify what happened last year. And the new blood that it has. I think it'll be interesting. It'll take some time to work some things out, but I definitely think it's a team that can make the playoffs. Is that going to be good enough for Joe Spallina? No, it's not. But I think that's a fair assessment to make on them for sure. And they are good. They are a good defensive team. I know last year there was a lot of concern with the loss of Eddie Gleisner and with Garrett Epple going to the Cannons and with John Sexton retiring. There was a lot of concern and worry about the players that they brought in just not having experience. And there were some games, especially in the beginning of the year, where they needed some time to learn about playing together and adjust to the system. But, I think just having that experience, you got to remember Chris Fake had played one PLL game. Conlon was a rookie, and they're going to bring in Cole Kastner this year. That's also going to be effective. I know they're pretty high on BJ Ferrer. So this is a good defensive team that I think is going to be even better next year. It's just going to be how quickly does the offense show.
Yeah. And to your point about only having to beat one team in the West, even if you assumed everything was basically the same as last year, if you look at them in the Chaos, they've made so many good moves, and the Chaos have basically kind of stayed still. So you'd have to feel like if nothing else changes, they can beat Chaos and make it. So yeah, no, I would agree that I would have to imagine that they are at the very least a playoff team. So that is it for PLL discussion. I wanted to get you out on this. I want 3 WrestleMania predictions from you.
Oh, wow. That's tough because as we talked about, I've been watching a lot more like, Elena of Avalar and Fancy Nancy and the Descendants than I have wrestling lately. But I've tried to keep track. I think we'll see John Cena win the championship.
You think he's going to win? Okay.
I think he's going to win. I don't care either way. I've enjoyed Cody. I like Cody's run. I just think storyline purposes, what does it do if Cody beats him? We're just in the beginning of John Cena's farewell tour. I think we're going to give him a little bit more meat on the bone here, especially with this big turn.
Can I say one thing that might maybe change your mind?
Okay.
They're playing very hard on this. I'm going to win 17 and ruin wrestling for everyone. That's kind of John Cena's mantra thing right now, and they're hitting it so hard that it makes me feel like he's going to lose, and it's going to flip him back. But I agree that the idea with the heel turn made more sense, that he turns heel, wins 17, and then they can go through the summer with him as a heel champion. Mm-hmm. They're just hitting it so hard. I'm like, are we?
But sometimes with wrestling, we look for the swerve so much that we gotta just pay attention to what they're telling us. We gotta just pay attention to what they're telling us. So that's one. I don't even know what some of the matches are. I know there's the big triple threat with Punk, Roman, and Seth Rollins. I'll walk out on a limb, and I'm being sarcastic when I say that. Paul Heyman is going to get involved somehow. Paul Heyman will get involved in that match somehow, and not even involved in the sense that he's a distraction on the outside. He will be in the middle of the ring, and there will be a moment where he's going to have to decide Punk or Roman Reigns.
I saw an old clip of him macing. I wasn't watching at that point.
Reigns, yes.
But they were saying that's what's going to happen at WrestleMania, is that he's going to end up like macing him again.
I saw another video in that contract signing the other night when Roman Reigns tells CM Punk to acknowledge him. There's a video, like the camera is looking at him, and he shakes his head no and says, "Don't do it." Mm-hmm. And again, when we're looking to get the maximum storylines out of these guys, how much longer are we going to go with Heyman and Reigns, right? Like, there's going to be a new wrinkle in there. Same way there was a new wrinkle when Heyman turned on Punk at Money in the Bank, which was my first ever WWE live pay-per-view event that I ever attended. Was the year that...
Oh, okay. You were there.
I was there in Philly.
When did you start watching wrestling?
Man, I started watching wrestling probably 96, first grade, right?
96, okay.
Yeah.
First grade?
Yeah. My mom was very trusting of me and my brothers. Very trusting. And we
I was just saying that you were in first grade in 96. That makes me feel old.
Fair enough.
I was in sixth grade then, and well, depending on when exactly, I was in sixth or seventh grade, but yeah.
That's not that much longer. It feels bigger because there's a big difference between the mentality of a first grader and a sixth grader. But
yes.
That's not that big of an age gap. So that's number two. Man, number three, I don't know. What I really want to say, and partially just because I know what the big matches are, what I really want to say is we'll get something where we're going to get Bianca Belair against Jade Cargill. I think there's something more with that storyline.
Okay, a turn in that story. Okay.
Yeah, and the triple threat just doesn't make any sense to me. We've been waiting for a collision course between Rhea Ripley and Bianca Belair for years, since they were the last two at the Rumble years ago. It feels like they've been that next generation after the Four Horsewomen. So it feels like they've been on this collision course, and then at the last minute, we're throwing in Io Sky, who is super talented and super cool, but it's like, why right now at your biggest event? And she's got this side story going on. It just seems like there's a little much there. And it seems like if they do go that route where they go somewhere with Jade Cargill and Bianca, then they can save an even more, kind of like Triple H and The Rock, or The Rock and Stone Cold. We'll see Rhea and Bianca again somewhere down the line, but it's not going to be in the near future.
Yeah, it feels like that match specifically, it could have been any combination of a one-on-one match between those three, and it would have been fine. But cramming all three of them into this one match has felt really weird. But yeah, one more. I like your picks. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with every single one of them, but one more that I need Becky back.
Oh yeah, of course. Love it.
She's been gone. She's been gone too long, and I was really thinking she was coming back at the Rumble, and she didn't. And so I'm hoping for a WrestleMania. Maybe she comes as Charlotte, or
I was just gonna say she comes out and you think she's gonna help Tiffany Stratton. She comes out and helps Charlotte. And not that we need like, the heel Becky persona when she first came back after, giving birth or whatever, but like just this kind of I need to see. We didn't get it when Sasha was there, but we need to see Charlotte, Becky, and Bayley team up, and they need to do it against the new up and comers. We need to see it. So let's go. That'd be fun.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you joining me on the show today. I know we could talk all day, and we really might. There's a whole off season. We might have to have an actual lacrosse wrestling episode and see what happens. You and I might be the only ones listening, but
no. Last year at last year's championship series, when the Archers brought in Tommy Palasek, I was going nuts on Twitter with comparing all these different wrestling gifs and things. And I'll tell you what, that was a week where I got a lot of attention for those. So there's an audience out there.
I love it. All right. Well, maybe we'll figure something out, and I'm sure you'll be back on to talk Redwoods at some other point this season. So again, thanks for joining us.
The next book, you send me a message, we'll do it.
All right. Sounds good. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.
A huge thank you to Phil for joining me today. He is such an awesome dude. And if you are a lacrosse fan, you should absolutely be following his work. But if you are a Redwoods fan, it's a non-negotiable. You absolutely have to be following Phil and checking out his articles for the PLL. And again, if you haven't already, go pick up Major League Life. It's an excellent read. I promise you won't regret it. Hopefully we can get Phil back on the show at some point during the PLL season. He'll be a little bit busy, but hopefully we can make it happen so that he can break down things that have happened throughout the year. Maybe we can even sneak in some more of that wrestling/lacrosse crossover talk that I thoroughly enjoy. Hopefully you guys enjoyed as well. I'm sure there are lots of you wrestling fans out there. As always, thank you guys for listening and or watching today's episode. I really, really do appreciate it. I hope that this second episode this week really kind of makes up for the fact that I have been absent for a couple of weeks. I am trying to put in some processes that make sure these episodes get out in a more timely manner on a regular basis, but I appreciate you guys bearing with me as I work this out and try and figure out exactly how to get this happening week in and week out. I had several people reach out to me this past week asking about the next episodes and when they were coming out, and it was really cool for me to know that you guys are listening and that you want to hear more. So thank you for that. Let me know your thoughts on this week's episodes, and don't forget to send me your questions for next week's episode, because that's all I've got for you guys this week. But I will be back next week to break down all of the things that happen in the world of lacrosse over the next couple of days. In fact, I am actually headed down to Boston on Saturday to see Duke take on Boston University in person. It should be a great matchup, and hopefully I won't have to awkwardly pretend that I didn't just tell y'all that I was going to the game, and Duke handles the Terriers and we can just move forward from there. It does look like it's going to be a good game though, so we will see. But until next week, I'll catch you guys on the internet.